In this episode of the Project Management Podcast, we will look at the life cycle of Agile requirements and how to use visual models to identify epics and user stories.
Hello and welcome to the Project Management Podcast at pm-podcast.com. I'm Cornelius Fichtner. We are coming to you live from the inspiring 2017 PMI Global Conference in Chicago. And with me right now is Betsy Stockdale. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How has your conference been so far? You look very chipper.
Oh, well, of course, because it's really great to be here, and it's really fun to listen to a number of these different sessions and just get inspired on things that I might be able to take back to the office with me.
Wow, and I used the word inspire just a moment ago.
You did, and that was not planned.
Completely not. So what have you seen so far?
Oh, well, the keynote was awesome, obviously. And then there was a couple of others, especially around Agile, and I'm definitely working in an Agile world these days.
Yeah.
So just, attending some of the sessions with regards to Agile and really, trying to pick up some tips and tricks that I can take back to my organization and my teams.
And the energy is really fantastic this year. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah. Let's move on to your presentation. Have you already presented?
No, I actually present tomorrow afternoon.
Okay. And your presentation is about Not Your Mama's Acceptance Criteria, a guide to writing excellent user stories. Now, at this point, we have to make one thing clear. You're not a project manager. You're a business analyst.
I am.
Yes. You are our backbone. You're the person we can't live without.
I like to think so.
Yes, absolutely. So, Not Your Mama's Acceptance Criteria, 2 words, acceptance criteria, a guide to writing excellent user stories. How do these 4 words, acceptance criteria and user stories, how do they match together?
Well, it's, in this Agile world, we really are looking at writing our requirements in a different format. So instead of the system shall statements over and 1,000 times over, we're really using much more natural language to write our requirements. And that's the user story part. And so that's very helpful in terms of understanding what it is that, who our user is and what they're trying to accomplish. But the meat of the material is really in the acceptance criteria. That's what really helps us understand what is it that our folks are trying to accomplish. And it really helps our developers understand what it is the software needs to do. And the testers, they understand what to test.
Mm-hmm. So in other words, the acceptance criteria are part of the user story.
They are.
Okay, good. What is your interest in this topic?
Well, as a business analyst, this is essentially my core, and this is what I do all the time. I'm writing, user stories, and I'm writing acceptance criteria to go along with them. But I also want to really make sure that I completely understand what my stakeholders are looking to accomplish and what their objectives are, because I want to make sure that whatever the requirements that I'm writing reflect that, to make sure that they get software that is valuable and beneficial for them.
Mm-hmm. And how important are user stories with good acceptance criteria in your day-to-day work?
They're indispensable. Without it, then, well, who knows what our developers will come up with. They get creative if you don't give them an idea of what it is you're looking for.
Okay.
And that may not be a good thing.
Your presentation centers around a process: identify, elaborate, refine, and ready, in order to get to a good, well-written user story that includes those fabulous acceptance criteria. Is this a standard process? Where does this come from?
So it is, in my mind anyway, and with my coworkers at C-level, and it really is helping us understand that just because we're Agile doesn't mean that we just start writing requirements. There's a whole process to understand and figure out what it is that we do. And I think a lot of times, especially in the Agile space, people forget that, right? It's not we just start developing with our first sprint. You have to have that product backlog, and that product backlog has to come from somewhere. And so this process is really about understanding, well, what is it that needs to be in that product backlog and getting to that point. So that way we have the backlog ready for our first sprint.
Okay, so we have identify, elaborate, refine, and ready. Identify has 4 substeps. elaborate 2, 3 rather, refine has 3, ready has 2. How much time do you invest in a user story in order to get it to ready?
Well, it kind of depends. But, I think on average, you could probably look at it and say that every user story probably takes 3 to 5 minutes each if you were looking at it from beginning to end. Now, obviously, it's a very iterative process. We're going to do a little bit, and then we're going to do a little bit something else, and then we're going to do a little bit more before it's actually all ready to go. And there's always more than one. So if you probably look at, from the beginning to end, 3 to 5 minutes per story is about right.
3 to 5 minutes? You're very quick. It takes me days to write good user stories. All right, let's begin with the beginning. Identify. What do we do in the identify?
Identifying is really getting down to understanding what it is that the business wants to accomplish. All of our projects that we're working on is we're trying to either take advantage of an opportunity or solve a problem. And so I need to understand what that opportunity or that problem is in order for me to be able to move forward, or actually the whole team to move forward. So that whole identify section is really getting a good understanding of that. Because without it, then we may build something that doesn't meet the needs of our business.
At that point, if I identify, I'm probably at a pretty high level. That means we're writing epics at that moment, right?
Yes. And it could even be higher than epics. It could be an initiative or, pick your word. But yes, it's extremely high level. Let's start figuring out what is it that we actually need to build.
Okay. Process flows are also part of this.
Absolutely. Well, because they're going to be using the software as part of their business processes. So if I don't understand, even at that high level, what that business process is, then I don't understand how they're going to use the software or how they're going to use it to take advantage of that opportunity or solve that problem.
And how about business objectives?
That's all part of it. That's actually at the very beginning. So we like to create something called a business objectives model, which really helps us understand what the problem is and how we think we would solve that problem or what the solution would actually look like.
Is all of this happening before the official, and I'm making air quotes here, the official project has started? Or when do we get into this?
It really depends on how you define the start of the project. So in a purist business or like a project management world, this is probably all part of like the project charter. And really kind of understanding, again, what is it that we're attempting to accomplish here? Now, many times I don't see so many charters anymore. And so if I don't have this information available for me when I show up on a project, then I feel it's incumbent upon myself to go back and take those few steps back to say, no, I need to understand this. Because otherwise, I'm not driving towards the solution and I'm wasting everybody's time and money. And I don't want to do that either.
And how do people react when you do that?
It depends on who they are. Senior managers actually are pretty good about it, especially if I tell them that a lot of times I'm doing this to make sure that I can control our scope and, not worry about the extra stuff that people get excited about or that they may want us to build, and that we're going to focus on really making sure that we build a solution for them. They're very, very welcoming. Middle managers, especially people who think, no, we just need to get going, maybe not so much, but most of them understand. So it's usually pretty well taken.
Okay. So in the identify process step, we have the 4 sub-processes: the understand the objectives, identify and prioritize features, and then create the process flows. And the last one seems easier said than done, I say. It's identify user stories.
Yes.
How do you identify the user stories? Because at that point, you have such a big thing in your head.
Yes.
How do you now go from all of this? How do you break it down?
Well, that's where actually a lot of just the objectives and even the user stories help us understand, well, what are these high level things? We also create something called a feature tree, which kind of helps us start to think of what those high level features are and break it down into smaller bits. So all of this actually helps us create, the user stories and even like a story map, right? Here's like our high level process. Here's the features and functions, which turn into our epics. and break down into stories, here's what we need to have in order to create the software for this particular process.
So it's basically just a matter of starting somewhere and just breaking it down and continuing and not stopping until you're done.
Yeah.
How do you know you're done?
Well, you're done when everybody says, what, this is good enough.
Well, we've run out of bagels.
We've run out of bagels, or we've run out of time, or everybody gets dispersed to another project because it's good enough. We're never actually fully done. But, as long as we feel like we're good enough, that's when we're done.
And I think we're never really fully done is underlined by the fact that the next step, big step, is elaborate.
Yes.
What do we do now that we have this initial list of user stories?
Right. So elaborate really kind of goes into understanding even a bit more. And we even start going in and having some design sessions, because I know, especially with our stakeholders, they have a vision in their head on what this thing looks like and what it's going to do. So the sooner I pull that out of them and understand where they're coming from, the better. So it's really going through and saying, all right, well, let's talk about this process. Let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's go into the next layer and understanding it a little bit more. What do you think these user screens might look like, right? Let's talk about the different ways that we might be able to solve this problem. And it may not always be software related. It could be a process thing that we just need to change. And so, well, gosh, that's even better. We don't have to build anything. If we make some tweaks in our processes, let's do it that way. So it's really kind of going through and really, peeling that onion. It's that next layer.
Okay. So in the last 5-6 minutes, we talked about, writing user stories. But your presentation title, not your mama's acceptance criteria. When do the acceptance criteria start to come into play?
Right. That's in the refine phase.
Okay. We're not there yet.
Not quite.
Okay. So we're still developing these user stories.
Yes.
Under elaborate, you also have create mock-ups.
Yes. That's what the whole system might look like, or the screen mock-ups. So let's start putting different options out there. And so it's really kind of thinking through, well, gosh, do we need to have this all on one screen, or is this a flow and a workflow that we need to have here? So, there's different ways that we can always solve things. So it's looking at the various options that are available and then choosing one direction that we think is going to be best for that user community.
Okay. And then lastly, under elaborate, elicit story point estimates.
Yeah.
How do you like to elicit them?
Well, that's actually going through, and we kind of call it story time. But let's sit down with the development team, because the estimates need to come from them, and say, all right, here's what we've got. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's these high-level user stories and epics that we have. Haven't gotten to all the detail yet. That's coming in refine. But, from your first gut feel, how big do you think this thing might be? And, really having that conversation back and forth and getting them to come up with, putting some, numbers to paper.
One thing that the listeners don't see is all the tasks, the individual tasks we talked about so far, and in blue boxes, yet elicit story point estimates is in a gray box. Why is that in a gray box?
Well, it's in a gray box because that's actually something that's more of a team sort of thing. And it's not just me doing that. A lot of it is I'm leading it. But, when we get to eliciting in that gray box, that's really where, I'm working with our Scrum Master or our project manager to help, facilitate that whole effort, and really working with the team to come up with that.
Okay. We've done identify, we've elaborated, and now we're getting into the refine.
Yes.
And I was ahead of myself. Now the user acceptance criteria.
Now the user acceptance criteria.
Okay.
Absolutely.
How do we bring them into play now?
So now it's like we're peeling that onion yet again, right? We're getting into yet another layer of information. And so there's different sorts of things that we're going to be looking at, maybe another layer of the process flow, getting down into that nitty gritty. Here's the step-by-step tasks.
Yeah, it says create more detailed models.
Yes.
So what additional models would you build at this point?
So definitely process flows. Other things that we may look at are something that we call a DAR model, or a display action response model. And what that actually is it's actually taking our screen mock-ups that we have drawn earlier, and then going through and saying, well, how does this actually behave? Right? What happens when I press that button? Do I just automatically go to the next screen? Are there business rules behind it? Does it depend on where I am in the application? So that's all getting into that next layer of information, and that information actually helps us write those acceptance criteria. Because now we're talking about this is what the software needs to do.
Okay. Before we get into the acceptance criteria, let me ask you this. When it comes to user stories, there is this generic template that everybody rules as a role.
I want to,
etc.
Yes.
So that, do you have something very similar for user acceptance criteria?
I do. I actually write them in what they call a behavior-driven design format, or BDD.
Okay.
And it's essentially minimally three line thing. So it's given, when, then.
Okay.
And you think of given as, here's my precondition. Given that I'm logged in, or given that I have this information. When is the trigger? When I press this button. When I enter this information. Then, and this is now how the post condition, or what the behavior should be. When or then, we're moving on, or the system should behave like this, etc. So I like to write them as that given, when, then, versus just bullet points. And I've found that my developers love the given, when, then, because it gives them a lot more information than just, well,
what's supposed to happen when.
Yes.
But what if he's not logged in at this point? Well,
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes, and there's a whole nother acceptance criteria right there. Given that I'm not logged in.
Yeah.
Right?
Now, are we talking about acceptance criteria, or are we talking about test cases?
Well, there are acceptance criteria, but let me tell you, my testers love them too. Because essentially what I've done for them is I have just given them an outline for their acceptance, or for their test cases, that they can then elaborate even further.
Okay.
Yep. Very similar.
Next gray box under refine. So that means probably another team task here.
Yes.
Hold story time sessions with the team. What happens now?
So now I've got all the level of information. I've got all of the detail. So now it's actually going in and refining those story point estimates that we've given. Here's the next layer of information. Let's go through. Let's review these. I'm also asking my team, do you have enough information? Is there anything else that you need from me before you go off and start to develop these stories? Because it's possible there's something that's not clear. I am human. I miss stuff all the time. I will admit it. Ask my husband. He'll tell you I miss stuff all the time. But, I'm looking for that understanding that they've got enough information to move forward on. And so we'll refine our estimates, and then we'll also then start talking about, okay, there's nothing else, we're ready to go.
Who participates in the session?
So definitely we have whoever's actually on our Scrum team. So definitely the developers, definitely my Scrum Master. Definitely if I'm the product owner, then it's me. But if I have a separate product owner or product manager that's participating, they will definitely participate. Test. My QA folks need to be there as well. Anybody who needs to help us build whatever it is that we need.
Last but not least, big step is ready. So we've gone from identify to elaborate to refine, and now we are ready. Yet not quite, because there are still two tasks, one blue, one gray.
Yes.
For those who are paying attention, prioritize stories is the first one, and it's in blue. So that's something that you would do.
Yes, absolutely. So now that I've got all of this information, and I actually have my estimates from my development team as well, now I got to go through and prioritize. And so I have to look at everything and make a decision. Well, what's going to provide the most value for my individual stakeholders, and what's the best order to provide that value? There's always some artificialness involved as well. I like to tell a story that I had a project that I was working on where we were replacing a legacy system. The legacy system was one of these where it would just automatically save in the background, but if you never actually hit submit, you lost all of your data. And so that never seemed to make people happy. So one of their main requirements was like a big save button. Well, before we could have that nice big red save button for them, and we did make it red, so they were all happy they could see it, we had to have something to save. And so we had to have a story before then that was very basic. It was just header information, name of the request, who did it, time and date, save. But it couldn't be our top story, even though that was the most highly valued feature, because we had to have something to save first.
All right.
Can't make this stuff up.
Yeah. The gray box that we have here is add tasks with our estimates.
Yes.
So far, we've only talked about the story points.
Yes.
And now we're adding hours. Why are we adding hours into this?
So now what we're doing is we're actually getting ready to go and get started. So whether this is happening during maybe a grooming session or it's actually happening during sprint planning, this is where the development team says, all right, here's everything that we have about this story. What are the tasks that we need to develop or we need to have in order to develop that user story? So it's really going through and figuring out what the tasks are, and now it goes to hour estimates. It's going to take me 3 hours to do that database design. It's going to take me 2 hours to actually do the UI component, right? It's going to take me another hour to test, right? So now we're breaking each one of those down into the smaller bits, and we're starting our sprints.
Okay. So from all the blue boxes where you are personally involved in, which is the one that you struggle with most? Which of these tasks?
It's probably actually getting to understand what the business objectives are.
That's at the very beginning.
The
so that's
very
a
beginning.
very start.
Yes. Because so many times people have it in their head what it is that they want, but trying to verbalize that and tell you what it is or what their problems
Draw
are.
it out of them.
And that's why it's always elicitation, right? It's not I'm gathering requirements. I have to elicit and pull this information out of people because they don't really know. They just know they've got a problem, or we're not making as much money as we want, or gosh, we're wasting too much time over here, or there's this great opportunity if we could only, right? It's really getting through and getting down and understanding, well, what are those core objectives? So that way we can actually measure ourselves. Were we successful at the end? Did we solve this problem? Did we enable you to take advantage of that opportunity?
Okay. And which one of your tasks do you enjoy most?
Actually, that one as well.
Really? Okay. It's hard but enjoyable.
Yeah, it is, because it's really, going through and probing and asking the 5 whys in different ways. Why is that a challenge? Why is that a problem? What would it look like if we solved that for you? Right? And it's really going through and digging into that. It's a lot of fun.
Okay. And then, of course, we have the same questions for those tasks when you bring the teams in. So which one of these is the hardest, and which one do you think that the teams enjoy working on most?
Right. The hardest one, that's a good question. The hardest one is probably going through and eliciting the story point estimates. Simply because, we have a smidge of information, but we don't have it all yet. And there's always people out there who really want to really understand everything, because they're afraid, as with an estimate, that as soon as they start muttering numbers, that those estimates get poured into concrete and everybody holds them to that. So that one's probably the hardest, because it's trying to convince developers it's okay, just give me a number, best guess at this point in time. We can change it when we get more information. The ones that are probably the most fun is probably the story time at the end, because we have everything at this point, and then we can modify and change the estimates if necessary.
How well is the process working out for you?
Actually, it works very well. It's very iterative, right? With an Agile process, I'm kind of going through this over and over and over again. I don't have everything done at the very beginning, because that would be waterfall, right? But, I'm working on a project now with a team out in California, actually, and we just finished our first release. We're getting ready to start our second. And that was a question. Do we want to change anything in the process?
I was just going to get there.
And they said no.
Where do you tweak and change? And so it seems to be working quite well.
They even questioned, does it take forever to write these acceptance criteria? Would it be faster, Betsy, if we just did bullet points? And I'm like, no, actually, I prefer to write them in the given when then. And they all looked at me and said, good, thanks, because that's what we want. So...
That's good. Yeah. Okay. So when we have a user story, do you have multiple acceptance criteria per user story?
It depends on the story. It also depends upon the particular feature, and it also can depend upon how big your iterations or your sprints are. So, for example, the project I'm currently working on, we actually have 1 week sprints.
Okay.
So our stories actually have to be pretty small, which means my acceptance criteria tend to be 1, 2, maybe 3 acceptance criteria per user story, simply because my stories have to be small to fit into a 1-week iteration. Bigger or bigger sprints, if I have a 2 or a 3-week iteration process, then maybe they can be bigger and I'll have more. We like to kind of follow the, 7 plus or minus 2 rule, for example. No more than 9 acceptance criteria. Anything bigger than that is probably too big, and we should split the story. Ideally, and then this is under assumption of a 2-week sprint, but, ideally no more or no less than 5 acceptance criteria, but it really kind of depends.
Okay. And we've already talked about the duration takes a few minutes to write the user story. How much time do you invest in the acceptance criteria?
Probably a little less, but not actually all that far off. Because it's probably, let me think, maybe 1 to 2 minutes per acceptance criteria. By the time you think about it and you write it, usually, for me anyway, it goes pretty fast because I've got it in my head. I know what I need. So it's just...
When you originally said 3 to 5 minutes, I'm like... Really? She means 3 to 5. Should I ask if she meant 3 to 5 hours? Because in my head, that's about the amount of time that I spend thinking about these things and how do we best write this? And it's an arduous process for me to get these things onto paper.
But I've done a lot of that thinking and that other work, right, when I look at all these other phases. So when you're looking at the identify, right, I've already started that whole process of, in my mind, what is it that we need? And I'm drawing it out in some of these requirement models, whether it's a business objective model, whether it's a feature tree or process flows, that starts the whole process. So by the time I get to the point of, all right, now I'm ready to write user stories, I pretty much already have most of that hard work done. It's just actually going through and just writing it down
into words that people can read and understand. When you first get into a project and you propose this sort of approach to the team, what kind of resistance do you get?
The biggest one is people usually just want you to start writing requirements.
Okay.
Well, let's just get going. Let's just write. And it's like, write what? Well,
okay.
Write whatever. I don't care. Just start writing.
Really? You don't care?
Exactly. They do care. And a lot of times they haven't even really thought through on their own selves what it is that they really want to accomplish. So, we could start writing right away, but I'm probably going to redo all of that effort. So why don't we take a step back, do a little bit of the analysis, right? Just because we're Agile doesn't mean we throw out analysis with it, right? And so let's go ahead and get that understood so that way the rest of it goes much faster.
Okay. So you're presenting tomorrow, if I remember that correctly?
That is correct.
Yeah. What would you like the people who come to listen to you tomorrow take away from the presentation?
I think I'd love for them to take away that there's better ways to really go through some of that analysis aspect that makes it much easier at the end when you get to actually writing the user stories and the acceptance criteria. And I think also just there's better ways to write acceptance criteria. So many people just use the bullet points, but I have found through my own experience that that's usually not enough. Kind of getting into that given, when, then format really, it helps me even just think through, well, what is it that this thing needs to do? And that I just have better results at the end.
At the end of this presentation, I promise you people will walk up to the lectern and start asking you questions. And you'll be there another 45 minutes just answering whatever you didn't answer during the presentation. What kind of questions do you expect?
Usually I get a lot of the questions with regards, well, how much time does this take?
Okay.
Right?
We got that
do
covered.
Get a lot of it. Especially things like process flows. I hear a lot of business analysts say, oh, I would love to do process flows if I only had the time. Well, in my willow world, I make the time. I don't think I can write requirements without them. So it's a matter of talking through and helping them reprioritize just their own tasks. A lot of it is also questions about these various other types of requirement models we work on. So the business objectives model, feature trees, et cetera. So where they can find more information on those sorts of models.
Okay. Our listeners are all project managers. Many of them grew out of the waterfall-based, plan-driven projects, slowly moving into Agile. What recommendation do you have for them in regards to user stories and acceptance criteria? How do you get into this?
Right. A lot of it is just giving it a go. If you can't, And then that's essentially what I did, was just let me try to write these. They're difficult at first, right? Because it's a different format.
3 to 5 hours, yes.
That's right, 3 to 5 minutes. It's a matter of just trying and working and practice. And so it's not actually all that tough. It's just it's a different way of working.
Okay.
And I think, one of the biggest misconceptions about Agile is that we don't write anything down and we don't plan. Well, that's not true, right? There's a lot of writing. And, even if you look at the Agile Manifesto, it says, use the appropriate amount of documentation. It doesn't say
Zero. No. Yeah. Okay. I mentioned this in the beginning. You're a business analyst.
Yes.
The listeners, most of them are project managers. So as a business analyst, what is your greatest wish that you would like to make us understand?
That we're a team. That we need to work together. That it's not one person does one thing and another person does another. We're a team that we need to work together in order to accomplish our end goal. And so I love working with project managers that, will take maybe my little bit of advice in terms of here's the tasks that I need for the project plan. I usually have my own plan. Project managers are more than welcome to have it if they want to put it in, but I have to have something for myself just to know, am I even close to being ready to get started? But I think that's the biggest thing, is that we're a team working together.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much.